So let's get into it. Maybe that's where we start. We start with some of that United States women's national team content, Lisa, because amongst all of the news and notes that we've got to chat a little bit about, probably one of the biggest ones coming out of U.S. soccer, making an announcement of detailed plans for implementation of Sally Yate's 12 participant safety recommendations. So we're getting, I guess, what can be referred to as those next steps. So back in late October 2022, U.S. Soccer's independent commissioned investigative report with Sally Q. Yates dropped all into prior allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse within women's professional soccer. It was a very long, difficult, hefty report, difficult to read at times. It's something that had been covering, I think, over the past 18 months or so. And post publishing or announcement of that report, there was also that's sort of what comes next, right? So we saw U.S. Soccer put a few immediate things out to sort of address what all of the findings that had been reported. But since then, I think everyone was looking for that real next step in terms of what was going to actually be, the official next step. So we've got a lot of different things they're implementing essentially all 12 of the recommendations from the Sally Yates investigation. The program is going to include safety training, annual verification of background and contact information, background checks. Compliance with the new program will be a multi-year journey. It's going to be the first ever piloted by U.S. Soccer staff and select members before expanding to U.S. Soccer licensed coaches and referees, and then later on to all adult participants. So there was a lot. I mean, we're talking about 12 recommendations here. So there was a lot to get through, but I think there was a lot of little things in the build up to announcing implementing all 12 of these next steps that U.S. Soccer was already trying to go ahead and implement. I mean, at one point, if you're someone who has followed us for a while, we've had Danielle Slayton on the show with us before on Attacking Third. She is someone that has now been involved in some of the task forces and everything with U.S. Soccer sort of post investigation results. Hearing her chat about those next steps on the shows is very, very fascinating, because I think that's the era in which we're leaning into now. There's a lot of former players getting back into the space, players who have gone through, a lot of things themselves or have teammates who have, in sort of talking about what, helping and having a hand in shaping what they want the next era of women's football to be in the United States. Mana Shim also, being named as part of the safety task force. So there's a lot of moving parts in these. And so everybody loves an infographic for sure. So that's very, very helpful to have those as well. But I think within all of these, Lisa, is there anything in particular that maybe stood out for you? Was there something that you were just like, this is an intriguing component, like right here?
I think the timeline, first of all, is one thing that kind of stood out to me, because the initial report and the results of the Sally Q. Yates investigation dropped about 3 months ago. And maybe I'm a bit pessimistic on the productivity of large companies. And I probably am, because the fact that U.S. Soccer could drop something 3 months ago and say, we're going to work to make a lot of these changes and we're going to put things in place, it's a lot easier said than done to get a board of directors that are focused solely on safe sport, to hire the correct people in the role. And you talked about Mana Shim being one of those people hired to fill a role of the safety task force, to have someone like a Danielle Slayton who is brought on to be a leader of these various things, implementing the committee chair as to this Yates investigation, and then to come out within 3 months of plans to implement these 12-step safety implications. Because after the results dropped and there were 12 steps, some of them it was like, okay, yeah, this is easy to implement. Like, you start looking into the background of every person that's currently hired or in position of power or in a role within U.S. Soccer and all of the branches below. But some of these other steps that were recommended by Sally Yates are much more difficult to implement. So the fact that within a 3-month turnaround, before the MLS season gets kicked off, before the NWSL season gets kicked off, that US Soccer has announced these detail plans. That's the first thing that I was like, okay,
Yeah.
hey, they're moving, they're working behind the scenes, because if it took a little bit longer, I probably wouldn't have been that surprised. It just takes a long time for gears to turn it with so many different moving parts. But another asset of this and factor of everything that was detailed in this is one of the things that stood out to me is that these proposed amendments are going to U.S. Soccer's pro league standards, meaning that it is going to go throughout every single professional soccer league affiliated with U.S. Soccer. That's the MLS, the NWSL, the USL, the NASL, the North American Soccer League, the NISA, the National Independent Soccer Association. Every single one of these associations and leagues are going to have to fall under the exact same protocol. To me, that stood out because a lot of these the reason for this stemmed in the NWSL and stemmed from a lack of resources, a lack of human resources for these players, a lack of believing these women and making sure that they are trusted. And the fact that US Soccer then said, okay, if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. And it doesn't matter if you're in the NWSL or the MLS or the USL, we want to make sure our players are protected and everyone feels safe going to work every day. So they made it universal across all of their leagues and everything that US Soccer governs, that and some of the bullet points that they proposed in there were some things that where I was like, we still don't have this, like a human resources
Yeah.
department for every single association and every single branch. Okay, that's great. That they need to have a dedicated human resources person. They have to have safeguarding the reports. They also have to have player feedback surveys annually. Those are some of the things that they implemented. But pretty cool that they did it across all four of the leagues under U.S. Soccer. I mean, that stood out to me. What about you when you read all of this and you had to digest it and kind of rewrite it all for CBS and what you do? Is there anything that you kind of kept coming back to and thinking about?
I'm with you in terms of, seeing that these are 12 recommendations that are going to be implemented like in multiple leagues and different facets. I mean, because when you look at the different tiers of soccer within the United States, you have like those premier tiers, which is like considered like, MLS or NWSL, and then all these other secondary tiers as well. And it sort of makes sense. You're just like, yes, you're going to want to have these things across
Mhm.
the board to ensure that there's safety for everyone at all levels. So I'm with you on that. But there are other things within it that were really, really intriguing for me, like just the concept of something like no NDAs, no non-disclosure
Yeah.
agreements. Was something that really, really stood out to me, in a good way. It made me happy to see that that was something that they addressed specifically,
Yep.
because even though there were very not only multiple but very long and thorough investigations into various allegations of abuse, harassment, sexual misconduct, specifically in women's pro soccer. Something that kept coming up, unfortunately, within these very long and stressful moments was these concepts of these NDAs, that there were hiccups. I guess we'll just refer to them as hiccups that were taking place within these investigations. Right, you had the investigators, saying in the public release of the findings that there were areas and moments of time that unfortunately there wasn't always cooperation with specific teams, whether it was Portland Thorns or Chicago Red Stars or Racing Louisville FC. And
Yeah, racing
and
local.
Racing stands out specifically with these
Yes.
NDAs because
Yeah.
there was something they kept referring to these NDAs as something that they were was because of those things that they were unable to perhaps fully participate in the manners in which they themselves even wanted to participate, right? Baloney. But I'm looking at something like that, and I'm just kind of like, I'm happy to see that that's something that they
Yes.
addressed
Mhm.
within these 12 recommendations. So it's saying, like, in terms of having something like non-disclosures or non-disparagement agreements, right? That is something that you can that we can look back at now in all of these investigations and sort of see how that connects to the possible allegations of abuse. And so to sort of take a look at that and address that, and ensure that there's,
Mhm.
they want to make sure that there's all these resources for players and staff moving forward to be able to report the things that they go through in a respectful, private, safe manner. I think is important. So there's a lot of there's a again there's a lot of different things within all of this, and there obviously everything's out on a press release. I would encourage
Yeah.
folks to thumb through it whenever they
And
can. um
they also talk about at the end of the press release, reiterating that their U.S. Soccer wants to have transparency throughout
yeah.
this, throughout everything that they're implementing, through things moving forward. And I know that seems so obvious. And so, of course, you have to have transparency, especially in today's age with social media and how quickly things regurgitate around and get moved around the space. But I think it's important that they are saying that, and like it's almost like an accountability check on US Soccer, that they put it at the end of their report that, hey, we're committed to ongoing transparency and keeping players, US Soccer membership, and the public regularly updated on the process of these safety efforts, because that's something that they didn't have to say, right? We, as public, I think sometimes we expect transparency, and when we don't get it, we're flabbergasted. But this is something that they're kind of holding themselves accountable to and saying, yeah, we're going to continue to be transparent about what we're doing, the steps we're taking, and how we're implementing all of this. Like they were. I mean, yeah, like you said, go read through this, people that are really interested in it, because it's fascinating, some of the little details that they put in here. And within the release, that US Soccer just put out the other day, they actually go back and highlight the 12 Yates recommendations by number. They go 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. And then within those, they add bullet points as to what exactly US Soccer is doing to put those recommendations into place.
I also just think it's like just a really, I guess, a sort of transition out of this and into to NWSL stuff that we'll chat about in a moment. But it's just really interesting to sort of see all of this, all these things sort of coming out, and seeing U.S. Soccer navigate their part of it, and seeing NWSL navigate their part of it. That um, it's an important thing to note about the transparency, because it almost sort of
Mhm.
feels, I guess, for lack of a better word, refreshing. It's like it's something that maybe we didn't necessarily assume that you would get, like as in the public, sort of all of these updates and findings and reports and next steps, with the league themselves, issuing out corrective actions based on their own third party investigations that come to play, and then not only issuing these corrective actions, but like putting out the information alongside of them, like there these were the allegations that were brought forth. An investigation took place. These are the things that were found within the reports. These are also the things that were
Yeah.
unsubstantiated. That's also an important part. And based on all of those things, here are the further corrective actions. And like to sort of see that come out, like whether it's on the league side over
Mhm.
the last month or so, or the U.S. soccer side implementing the safety recommendations. It just sort of feels a little bit different than from things, and how business was conducted basically in years past. So I guess, maybe for lack of a better word, refreshing is the one that comes to mind. But of course, as always, it's going to be something that we keep an eye on, and remain watchful of, and make sure that we talk about it and discuss it, whenever appropriate. So we'll see. Hopefully, now that there are these appropriate things in place, we talked about that a little bit on a previous episode, Lisa, how important it is
Mhm.
to allow these things to sort of exist and do their due process. There's sometimes that comes with it, like all of this stuff when it gets announced. There's also a little bit of that energy where it's just like, oh my gosh, like here we go again, not again. This is exhausting, right? The burnout for some folks. I guess if they're fans of women's soccer, if they watch the league or U.S. women's national team. But it's so important to note that unfortunately, for decades, a lot of resources and policies and things like that didn't exist. So when these things kind of come out in a small way, they should be celebrated, even though the way in which they have now arrived has been very, very painful. So hopefully moving forward, now that there are a ton of these resources, there will
Yeah.
be all the appropriate avenues and channels to ensure that there will, be safe places within women's soccer.